Hi everybody, welcome to Chapter 7, Language in Society. We as human beings, we live in societies, and the societies have features that would affect the way we are using language. For example, economy might influence the way we are using the language. And we as human beings, we have features that might influence the way we are using language. We are males, females, and our gender would influence the way we are using language. We are in different ages, and as young people and as old people and as children, we are using different forms of language. That is, the forms of the language that we are using are affected by different factors from the society, different social factors. In this chapter, we will start first with the different geographical places and the languages that are spoken there, and how we can make a distinction between one dialect and another dialect, and how we can plot these differences. The cover term for this is dialectology. After that, we will talk about social dialects. That is, the variations in language use as a result of some social factors like gender, ethnicity, age, social class. Then we will discuss languages in contact. When people come into contact and they do not share a language, what do they do? And after that, we will talk about language and education. And as we are going through that, we will talk about the different scenarios that are there for bilingual education, and including linguistic variations. We will finish this chapter by language in use in different situations, in different occasions, how different situations would affect the way we are using language. The cover term for studying language in society is sociolinguistics. And in this chapter, we are dealing with sociolinguistics. We will first start with dialectology. In dialectology, we study dialects. And we will start from any individual speaker that is speaking. Every one of us speak in our own unique ways. It has its own unique characteristics. Like the kind of words that we choose to speak would be different, or the syntactic structures that we might choose to speak would be different. Even within the same family, siblings might speak in different ways, and it has their own unique characteristics. So, the language of an individual speaker has its own specific unique characteristics, and it is called idiolect. How many idiolects do we have in a society? as many idiolects as the speakers that we have. If we have a community, a country with 1 million Persian speakers, for example, we have 1 million idiolects. So every person has a idiolect. The dialect of any individual is called idiolect. But when it is shared with more people, like the dialects that are shared with more people, because we are speaking in a society, and we can notice that the way we speak, in spite of its unique characteristics, has a lot of similarities with what others are speaking. So we share either a dialect or a language with those people in the community. But how can we say whether it is a dialect or a language? For the definition of dialect, it has been mentioned that dialects differ from each other in systematic ways. For example, they are different in the vowels that they are using. In some dialects, they make a difference between kot and kot, but in another dialect, they would say kot. So the differences are systematic, but they are mutually intelligible. That is, they can understand what the other person is saying. When it becomes mutually unintelligible, then we are encountering a different language. That's a language that is different from what we speak. So mutual intelligibility and systematic differences have been mentioned as criteria for distinguishing dialects and languages. And when we are talking about dialects, you should keep it in mind that it is not a degraded or inferior form of a language, because any language that is official language of a country, a national language, that has been a dialect. A dialect that has gained prestige and it has written forms. We will talk about what makes a dialect a standard language. So any standard language is a dialect. Therefore, dialects are not degraded forms of a language. There's nothing bad or wrong with dialects, but that dialects would differ from each other in systematic ways. That's why Weinreich has said a language is a dialect that has an army and a navy. It points to some considerations in when to call a form language or a dialect. When we are dealing with languages that are spoken in the world, it's not really easy to decide where the differences would tell us that we are facing two different dialects or two different languages. One of those considerations is related to politics and social considerations. For example, Swedish and Norwegian, they are mutually intelligible, but they are regarded as two languages. Why? just because they are spoken in two different countries. So you see, a political matter, political boundary would override the definition that we have given for language and dialect. They are called two different languages, however, they are mutually intelligible. In fact, they are two different dialects. But due to political issues, and since they are spoken in two different countries, they are regarded as two different languages. Another case that comes in contrast to this is what we find in China. Chinese has an ideographic writing system, and therefore all people in China can communicate with each other in the written form. But when it comes to spoken languages, yeah, I said languages because there is no one language. They have many different languages, and these languages are unintelligible. But since they are spoken in one country, they are called Chinese, like Mandarin and Cantonese. Mandarin and Cantonese, they are two different languages because they are mutually unintelligible. But they are regarded as dialects of Chinese. Another factor that is responsible for calling two different forms of communication language rather than dialect is writing system. Urdu and Hindi are very similar, and they can be dialects rather than languages, but they are using two different writing systems. In Urdu, they are using Arabic script. In Hindi, they are using Devanagari script. Another case is what happens in Serbian and Croatian. In Serbian, they use Cyrillic script. In Croatian, they are using Roman script. However, they are very similar, they are mutually intelligible, and they are a single Slavic language. Just because they are using two different writing systems, two different languages have been recorded. One thing about dialects is that it's really not easy to say where one dialect ends and the other dialect starts. If you go from one village to another village, well, they are mutually intelligible for those people who are in close contact with each other. But as you move far away from the first village, then you would not be able to say that they are mutually intelligible. For example, in Bushehr, in Dashti, if you start from Dashti and you know the language of Dashti, however, I should say it the other way around because Dashti is this specific case. If you start from Dashtistan and Bushehr, so the kind of dialect that is spoken is similar to Persian. As you move to Tangistan, you would come across some changes in the dialect that makes it different from what you might hear in Dashtastani. There is a new syntactic structure coming about so that you would not understand it. But this goes in a continuum so that if you start from, for example, from Borazjan, and then you go to Bondaruz, and then you go to Samal, Abad, Ahram. So people from these places that I tell you, they are speaking in what is mutually intelligible for them. And then the one who is speaking Ahrami and then Tangi Siri, they would understand each other, but a person who is speaking Persian or Dashtastani might not be able then to understand what the Tangisiri is saying, because that's a lot of difference in the dialect. It would become mutually unintelligible to a large extent. And when it goes to Dashti, it becomes fully unintelligible. Completely unintelligible. So here we are dealing with two different languages. They cannot be regarded as two different dialects because the syntactic structure is completely different. But it's not the case that there would be a sudden break, so that if you pass a certain village and then you enter the other village, then you would see such a change in the syntactic structure that they would use. Changes are little by little, and then they end up in having a lot of differences with the other dialects, and then you are entering a new dialect, and sometimes it's entering into a new language boundary. The idea that there is no sudden break between dialects gives rise to what we call dialect continuum. Based on dialect continuum, we say dialects merge into each other. And it is not the case that you suddenly go from one dialect to a new dialect and from a dialect into a language. It's not easy to draw a distinction between dialects as you are moving from one village, from one city to another city and village. But then when you look at it from a distance, then the point A that you have started and you get to point Z, the differences are to a large extent making the languages unintelligible to people who are speaking those in point 1, point A and point Z. In order not to have these differences, such drastic differences, some countries have decided dialect leveling. In dialect leveling, there would be more uniformity and less variations among dialects. Sometimes the countries have been successful through mass media in moving towards dialect leveling, but there are some communities who have a positive attitudes toward their dialect, their language, and they would prefer using that. Why? Because it shows their culture, it shows their membership in a certain community. Therefore, they keep that dialect. They stick to that dialect. They would not let it die, or would not let it to become uniform with other dialects. But this is a language policy. Dialect leveling involves making dialects similar to each other and making them less different. Here in Pygmalion, you read, "Phonetics, the science of speech, that's my profession. I can spot an Irishman or a Yorkshireman by his brogue. I can place any man within 6 miles. I can place him within 2 miles in London, sometimes within 2 streets." What does it tell us? It tells us that people who are speaking in the same way would center in one region, in one geographical place. Mark Twain, when he said, "The educated southerner has no use for an R except at the beginning of a word," is talking about R dropping, which is one of the distinguishing features between Southerners and those in the Midland who retain R. So when various linguistic differences accumulate in one geographical place, the language that is spoken in that area has its own specific character, like what we have here, Southerner dialect, that he was referring to Boston dialect, or what we called about in our case in Bushehr, that was a distinction between Dashti and Dashtistani. They are two different regional dialects. The origin of many regional dialects of American English is from England, and the place from which they have come to the United States would show itself in the way they are using forms. And based on that, there have been there are lots of dialects in USA, but 3 main classification of the dialect is that they talk about Northern dialect, which is spoken in New England and around the Hudson River. What do? They drop R like what happens in Southern England, in London. And there is a Midland dialect that is spoken in Pennsylvania. And what do? They retain R. Like what? Like people in the Northern England. And this feature has spread to Midwest and to Western. So it has moved from Midland to Midwest and Western part of the USA, and also a dialect leveling has followed, and it has given rise to the general American that we are somehow familiar with. As a Southern dialect, again, it's R dropping, like what we have in Northern dialect, and it's similar to what the settlers from Southern England has done. So the dialects that are the basic classification, the main classification of the American English dialects is based on where from England they have come. If they have come from Southern England, they drop R. If they are coming from Northern England, they are keeping R. People might have accents, and you can tell what is an accent compared to dialect. For example, when you are speaking Persian, but you are speaking Persian with Isfahani dialect, you can notice that that person has a certain way of pronouncing some words or intonation. The way that you can tell whether a person is a Bushehri or a Shirazi based on whether they lengthen the vowels or not. So accent is some phonetic differences that are related to geographical regions. And it's different from dialect. When we are talking about dialect, we are talking about differences more than what happens on just phonological and phonetic variation. It goes beyond that. It goes to lexical differences, syntactic differences, and more systematic phonological replacement substitutions. Some of the phonological differences in American English is that people from the South and Northeast, they say pajamas, but in Midlands they say pajamas. Or when it comes to British English and American English, around 48% of Americans, they pronounce the word as luxury, compared to 96% of British speakers who pronounce it luxury. In Busher, there is a very clear phonological difference between those who are speaking Borazjani and other cities and villages of Busher, and that's the difference in whether they are using o or a, as in khosh, khash. So Borazjani people would say khosh, other speakers use khash or khardan in Borazjani, but khardan in other villages of Busher or cities of Busher. Besides phonological differences, the dialects might differ from each other in the words that they use. For example, in British English, lift is used, but in American English, elevator is used. In British English, petrol is used. In American English, the same thing is called gas. In Busher province, there is a food that is made up of grains of wheat, and it's broken. So some people call it gemne, and some people, in some dialects, it is called lelak. So that's a case of lexical difference. Dialects might also differ from each other in terms of syntax. And in the United States, most Americans would use John and Mary will eat when we want to coordinate these two sentences. John will eat and Mary will eat. They combine it and coordinate that by saying John and Mary will eat. But in Ozark, in southern Missouri, John will eat and Mary. So this structure is ungrammatical to most Americans. And to us who know standard American English that is written in the books and for which there are grammars, such a structure is not. But this exists in Ozark dialect. Affiliation, they use double modals. He might could do it. And this is what is ungrammatical in most American dialects and in standard American. Or double objects like I caught me a fish. So such a structure is not allowed in most American dialects, but it's okay here. Or the use of he came a-running. Related to British English and American English, a British English speaker can say, I could have done, for the sentence I could have done it, but in American English, such a structure is ungrammatical. However, in American English, besides I could have done it, they use I could have, a structure that is ungrammatical based on the rules of British English. So between dialects, there might be some differences in the way the words are put into sentences in the sentence structure. Coming very close to our dialects and languages, for example, in Boucher province, in Tanger City, we for asking whether have you eaten lunch? Have you eaten lunch? جاست خورده? In Borazjani, that same sentence would be چاس خوردیه. And in other Dashtistani dialects, it would be چاس خوردیه. And that's for the same structure. Have you eaten lunch? نهار خورده‌ای؟ We can map the differences that the dialects have on a map. We can plot the dialectological differences on a map. Here, what you see is a dialect atlas or a dialect map of the places in which the word dot cheese and pot cheese are used. This map is by Hans Kurov, and he has said in A Word Geography of the Eastern United States that we can draw a map in order to show dialectological differences, the differences that we have between dialects. So, therefore, this dialect atlas, what does it show? It shows what are the dialect differences, and it plots it geographically. For example, the question is, in what places smear case is used, and in what places pot cheese is used and dot cheese is used. It's very similar to what we talked about when we were talking about lexical differences between words in Boucher. And you see that here it's mostly used smear, case, and dot cheese are used in these places, but then there is a block here separate from others in which dot cheese is used. And these lines that distinguishes one dialect from another dialect, and it is drawn based on dialect differences, is called isinglass. Isogloss, therefore, represents dialect differences. And each of these places in which you can see the dialect differences, they are called dialect areas. When we have more than one isogloss and several isoglosses coincide, sometimes with a political boundary or a natural barrier like sea, like mountains, rivers, then we have a regional dialect. And those isoglosses, they make bundle of isoglosses. So bundle of isoglosses always tells us that here in this place you have a regional dialect. Let's go to our example for Bushehr province. So this is the map of Bushehr province, and here I have made an isogloss for the distinction between the words that we use in order to call the broken grains of wheat as cooked, lelak and gemne. And there is another isogloss in another color, and that makes a distinction between the dialect differences in how the structure چاس خردیه, چاس خردتن is drawn. However, here close to this khardie we have khardie, but then that would be as a very small area in which Borazjani is spoken and some nearby places. And also there are some Turkish dialects and also Arabic dialects that we have not considered here. But if we look at some Iranian languages, dialects that are spoken here, we can make an isogloss for the lexical variation between lelak and gemne, and another isogloss for the difference between the structure of present perfect, which is different in Dashtastani and in Dashti and Tangisiri, but some part of Tangistan are not using this form, khardatan. But most people from that area and those in Dashtestan, they are using khardie. So that makes another isogloss, and you see that if we draw more and more isoglosses here, then you would see that there is a distinction between most Bushehri dialects and the dialects that are spoken in Dashti and by Tangisiri speakers. So that was for dialectology and what is there, like when do we call a form a dialect, when do we call it a language, how we can make boundaries between dialects by using isoglosses. And when we have bundle of isoglosses, then we know that we have two different regional dialects. In the next section, we will talk about social dialects. That is, the differences between the dialects as a result of living in a certain society with, for example, a certain socio-economic situation or because you belong to a certain social group.